last time we were starting chapter 3. And we're talking about measurements. Which means that if we have a data set like a sample and we have a whole bunch of numbers in that data set, how do we consolidate it into one measurement to describe something meaningful about the data set? And one thing meaningful we said we wanted to capture was the center. And the center, you can think of it as the most typical number. For example, if I give you guys a test, and of all the grades, I might want to see what the most typical test score is, or how the typical student is doing. So the center measures the typical value. And so what were some ways that we said people measure the center? What was one way that we talked about?
The mean.
Yeah, good. So the mean was one way. So the mean is just the average. It's just adding up all the numbers in that data set and dividing by the number of numbers. But we said that if you have a situation where each number might be weighted differently, for example, you could have the number, well, let's say, let's put it into context, something meaningful. Let's say that we have grades for a class. And let's say that we have homework, midterm and final. This is not for this class, but let's say that the homework has a certain weight associated with it. And let's say homework is weighted 10%. And the midterm, let's say, is 30%. And let's say the final exam is 60%. And let's say that these are the grades that you get in each. Let's say the homework, you get a 90. Let's say the midterm, you get an 80. And let's say the final is a 70. Let's say that we want to find the average grade. So typically the average grade would be to add up all the grades and divide by the number of grades. So in this case, can you just add up these three and divide by 3 to get the average grade? So no, because they're weighted differently. Because you have these different weights that are assigned to each one. So the final exam, for example, is weighted 60%, which is worth twice as much as the midterm. So you have to take the weights into account. So then we talked about the weighted mean. And so the weighted mean is you add up each of these grades this many times, and then you divide by the sum of those weights. So we ended up saying that there was a weighted mean formula. And it was equal to the sum, where we talked about how the sum, the notation was this notation. So we're going to sum up each grade multiplied by its weight. So in general, what we're trying to find the average for, we call x. So here the grade would be x, and the weight you can call shorthand is w. So we're going to multiply each value we're trying to find the average of by its weight. So in this case, we're going to add up each x by each w, so 90 times 0.1, and then plus the next value of x times its weight, 80 times 0.3, and then plus the next value of x times its weight, 70 times 0.6. And then we want to divide by the total number of instances. But in this case, the instances are basically the sum of all the weights. So here we would add up the sum of all the weights, and this is the weighted mean formula. So So here the sum of all the weights would be 10% plus 30% plus 60%, which is 100%. And 100% as a decimal, of course, is what? It's just 1. So basically you're dividing by 1, so nothing changes. So the result here would just be the same as whatever the numerator is. So this weighted mean, in this case, ends up just being whatever the numerator is. So, just so we have an idea of what this final answer is, go and punch this in. Let us know what you get. So this is 6.6, 15.6. So that looks like 75. So the mean here would end up being 75. And that's the mean of these grades where each one is weighted accordingly. So you notice that this is actually a different answer than if we had tried to just add up these 3 and divide by 3. Because if you added these 3 and divided by 3, what would you get?
80?
Yeah, you would get the 70, you would get the number that's actually in the middle of these. So you would get 70, but the real answer is 75. Any questions? Oh, sorry, so the mean, if you added up these numbers, you would get 80, not 70. So added up these 3 numbers divided by 3, you get 80, but these grades are weighted accordingly, so. And why is, just in terms of intuition, why is the correct answer less than if you had just added up the 3 numbers and divided by 3? Yeah.
Because they did worse on the final and it's worth the most.
Yeah, very good. So the final is worth this much. If you had added up the 3 grades and just divided by 3, that assumes that these 3 are weighted exactly the same. So that means that each of these is weighted 1/3 or 33.3%. But the final exam is worth actually 60%, which is so much more than everything else, and it's actually the worst grade. So the average will actually be shifted towards that worst grade. And so that's why the average is 75 and not 80, as if you had just added up the 3 grades and divided by 3. Any questions? Okay, so that's what we talked about last time. We talked about the average and in particular the weighted mean.